the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. In the autumn of 1932, the United States Public Health Service, in partnership with the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, initiated a study that would become the most infamous medical betrayal in American history. The official purpose was straightforward on paper: to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis in the African American male population. At the time, syphilis was a disease shrouded in stigma and misunderstanding, and researchers believed that the effects of the disease on the body, particularly on the cardiovascular and neurological systems, needed to be mapped over a long period. What began as a 6-month project, however, stretched into 40 years, transforming from a medical study into a systematic exercise in deception, cruelty, and racial injustice. The subjects were 600 black men from Macon County, Alabama, a region marked by extreme poverty and limited access to health care. Of these men, 399 had latent syphilis, while 201 served as a control group, free of the disease. They were recruited not through honest disclosure but through promises that were deliberately misleading. The men were told they were suffering from bad blood, a local colloquialism that encompassed a range of ailments including anemia, fatigue, and various infections. In exchange for participation, they were offered free medical examinations, hot meals, transportation to the clinic, and burial insurance. For impoverished sharecroppers and laborers, this was an offer impossible to refuse. What they were not told was the truth of their diagnosis. They were not informed that they had syphilis, a contagious and potentially fatal venereal disease. They were not told that the spinal taps performed on them were not treatments but procedures designed to detect neurological damage from the advancing infection. And they were never given the opportunity to consent to being subjects in a study designed to watch them die. The deception deepened as the years passed. In the 1940s, a landmark development in medical science rendered the very premise of the study obsolete. Penicillin was proven to be a safe and highly effective cure for syphilis. Public health campaigns across the United States began mass distribution of the antibiotic, and it became standard practice to treat any patient with the disease. Yet the researchers overseeing the Tuskegee study made a calculated and ethically catastrophic decision. They actively prevented the men from receiving penicillin. They worked with local draft boards to ensure that when the men were called for military service during World War II, they were marked as ineligible and thus denied the treatment given to soldiers. They coordinated with local physicians and public health officials to blacklist the participants, ensuring that no outside doctor would prescribe them the cure. The researchers justified this by arguing that the study was unique and that treating the men would destroy decades of accumulated data. The desire to complete a longitudinal study was placed above the lives of human beings. Throughout the 4 decades, the men endured not only the progression of the disease but also the rituals of a study designed to extract information without care. They were given placebos, aspirin, and iron tonics that did nothing to halt the damage spreading through their bodies. The spinal taps, which the men referred to as back shots, were performed without adequate anesthesia, causing severe pain and headaches. The researchers published numerous papers based on the data gathered, presenting their findings at medical conferences and in prestigious journals. At no point did any of these publications acknowledge that the subjects had been deceived or that they were being denied the standard of care. The men, meanwhile, believed they were receiving treatment. They buried their wives and children who contracted syphilis from them. They died of syphilitic heart disease, blindness, insanity, and other complications of the untreated infection, unaware that their suffering was being systematically observed and recorded. The study only ended because of a whistleblower. In 1966, a public health service venereal disease investigator named Peter Buxton grew horrified by what he had discovered. He repeatedly raised ethical objections to his superiors, but his concerns were dismissed. Finally, in 1972, Buxton took the story to the Associated Press. The resulting front-page headline, "Syphilis Patients Died Untreated," ignited a firestorm of public outrage. The nation was confronted with the reality that its own government had allowed men to die of a curable disease for the sake of research. A federal advisory panel convened to investigate, and within months the study was terminated. By then, only 74 of the original subjects were still alive. Of the 399 men with syphilis, 28 had died directly of the disease, 100 had died of related complications, and 40 of their wives had been infected, leading to 19 children born with congenital syphilis. The aftermath of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study reshaped the landscape of medical ethics in the United States. In 1974, the National Research Act was signed into law, creating the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This commission produced the Belmont Report in 1979, which established 3 core principles that now underpin all human subjects research: respect for persons, which requires informed consent; beneficence, which requires that subjects not be harmed and that risks be minimized; and justice, which requires that the burdens and benefits of research be distributed fairly. Institutional review boards were established nationwide to review and approve any study involving human participants. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal presidential apology to the surviving men and their families, acknowledging that what the government had done was clearly racist and deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study remains a cautionary tale not only because of the suffering it caused, but because of the trust it permanently eroded. For generations, it fueled a deep skepticism of medical institutions within Black communities, a legacy that would echo for decades. It stands as the definitive example of what happens when the pursuit of scientific knowledge is allowed to proceed without oversight, without accountability, and without regard for the humanity of the people being studied. Nazi medical experiments. The Nazi medical experiments represent the most extreme and systematic violation of medical ethics in human history. Conducted between 1939 and 1945 across the network of concentration camps that stretched across German-occupied Europe, these experiments were not the work of rogue individuals but were organized, funded, and sanctioned at the highest levels of the Nazi state. Physicians, many of whom were respected academics and leading researchers in their fields, abandoned the Hippocratic Oath entirely. They became architects of suffering, using the captive populations of the camps, Jews, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, and others deemed undesirable, as raw material for research that served the military ambitions of the Third Reich and the ideological goals of the Nazi regime. The experiments were conducted without anesthesia, without consent, and without any pretense of therapeutic intent. The subjects were not patients. They were expendable. One of the most brutal categories of experimentation involved high-altitude and hypothermia research, conducted primarily at the Dachau concentration camp. These experiments were commissioned by the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, which sought to understand the physiological limits of pilots who might be forced to eject at high altitudes or who might find themselves submerged in freezing water after being shot down over the ocean. At Dachau, prisoners were placed into low-pressure chambers that simulated altitudes of up to 68,000 feet. As the pressure dropped, the men experienced the excruciating effects of decompression. Nitrogen bubbles formed in their blood vessels, causing decompression sickness. They lost consciousness. Many died from cerebral hemorrhaging or suffocation as their lungs collapsed. Those who survived were often left with permanent brain damage. For the hypothermia experiments, prisoners were forced to stand naked in vats of ice water for hours at a time, sometimes as long as 14 hours. Their body temperatures dropped to dangerously low levels. Researchers then experimented with various methods of rewarming, including immersion in hot water and, in some cases, forcing the unconscious subjects into bed with naked women to test whether sexual stimulation could revive them. Of the hundreds subjected to these experiments, a significant number died frozen to death, their bodies convulsing as they succumbed to the cold. Simultaneously, at the Buchenwald and Auschwitz camps, researchers conducted experiments designed to test the limits of human endurance and to develop methods of treatment for battlefield injuries. One of the most notorious series involved the study of sepsis and bone regeneration. Prisoners were deliberately shot in the limbs or had incisions made into their muscles. Into these wounds, researchers inserted pieces of glass, wood, and bacteria such as streptococcus and gas gangrene. The goal was to simulate the types of wounds soldiers might suffer on the front lines and to test the efficacy of sulfonamide drugs in preventing infection. No anesthesia was provided. The wounds became infected, festered, and often led to gangrene. Many subjects died from the resulting infections or from the amputations that were performed without proper surgical care. Those who survived were often left permanently crippled. The researchers documented the progression of the infections with meticulous photographs and charts, treating the suffering of human beings as clinical data. Chemical and biological warfare research also featured prominently in the Nazi experiments. At the Natzweiler-Struthof camp in France, prisoners were exposed to phosgene and mustard gas in sealed chambers to test potential antidotes and protective measures. The burns caused by mustard gas were severe, blistering the skin and damaging the respiratory tract. Some subjects were deliberately wounded and then had mustard gas applied directly to their wounds to study the effects. At the Sachsenhausen camp, prisoners were forced to drink only seawater for days on end as part of a study to determine if seawater could be made drinkable through chemical treatment. The men suffered from severe dehydration, organ failure, and madness as their bodies were systematically deprived of fresh water. At Auschwitz, Dr. Joseph Mengele conducted his infamous twin experiments, driven by a pseudoscientific obsession with genetics and racial purity. He selected thousands of pairs of twins, most of them children, and subjected them to a range of procedures designed to unlock the secrets of heredity. They were measured, photographed, and injected with various substances directly into their eyes in an attempt to change eye color. Blood was drained from one twin and transfused into the other. Limbs were amputated, and organs were removed without anesthesia. When a twin died from the procedures, Mengele would kill the other with a single injection to compare the bodies in autopsy. Of the approximately 1,500 pairs of twins subjected to Mengele's experiments, only about 200 survived. The scale of these crimes was staggering. At Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp, dozens of young Polish women were subjected to brutal bone grafting experiments. Their legs were deliberately broken, and pieces of bone were removed to see how tissue regenerated. They were infected with gangrene and tetanus to test experimental treatments. The suffering was compounded by the fact that many of these women were political prisoners, Catholic nuns, and university students who had been arrested for resisting the occupation. They endured repeated surgeries without proper anesthesia, and many died from the infections or from the amputation of their limbs. Those who survived carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The Nazi medical experiments were not isolated atrocities. They were part of a broader system in which medicine was subverted to serve the ideological goals of National Socialism. Physicians played a central role in the T4 euthanasia program, which systematically murdered hundreds of thousands of disabled and mentally ill individuals under the guise of mercy killing. They conducted forced sterilization programs targeting those deemed genetically unfit. The experiments in the camps represented the logical endpoint of a worldview that divided humanity into categories of value and that treated certain groups not as persons but as research material to be used and discarded. After the war, the scale of these crimes was brought to light during the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, formerly known as United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al. 23 physicians and administrators were tried for their roles in the medical experiments and the euthanasia program. The trial revealed the extent to which German medicine had been corrupted by Nazi ideology and produced the Nuremberg Code, a set of 10 ethical principles that fundamentally reshaped the field of medical research. The first principle of the Nuremberg Code states that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It further requires that experiments avoid unnecessary suffering, that they be conducted only by qualified scientists, and that subjects be allowed to end their participation at any time. These principles, born from the horrors revealed at Nuremberg, became the foundation for all subsequent international guidelines governing human experimentation. The Nazi medical experiments remain the definitive cautionary tale of what happens when science is stripped of ethical constraints. They demonstrate with brutal clarity that the absence of consent, the dehumanization of subjects, and the subordination of individual welfare to the interests of the state lead not to legitimate scientific progress but to atrocity. The legacy of these experiments is not only the suffering of those who endured them but also the framework of protections that now exist to ensure that such crimes are never repeated. The Stanford Prison Experiment. In August 1971, a psychology professor at Stanford University named Philip Zimbardo embarked upon a study that would become one of the most famous and controversial experiments in the history of psychology. The official purpose was to investigate the psychological effects of perceived power and authority within a simulated prison environment. Zimbardo and his research team converted a basement hallway in the Stanford Psychology building into a mock prison, complete with 3 small cells, a closet repurposed as a solitary confinement chamber, and a narrow corridor designed to serve as the prison yard. They recruited 24 male undergraduate students through a newspaper advertisement, screening them for psychological stability and selecting only those deemed healthy and well-adjusted. The volunteers were randomly assigned to play the roles of either prisoners or guards. What was planned as a 2-week study was terminated after only 6 days, not because the data had been collected, but because the situation had spiraled into a level of abuse and psychological cruelty that the researchers themselves could no longer control. From the very first day, the transformation was swift and disturbing. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by actual Palo Alto police officers, booked at a real police station, and then transported to the mock prison blindfolded. They were stripped of their clothing, sprayed with a delousing agent, and issued uniform smocks and caps. They were assigned numbers rather than names, and each prisoner was fitted with a chain and lock around his ankle to symbolize the weight of captivity. The guards, by contrast, were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, and wooden batons. They were instructed to maintain order but were given no specific rules regarding how to do so. Zimbardo himself assumed the role of superintendent, positioning himself as the ultimate authority within the simulated environment. The guards quickly began to assert their dominance in ways that escalated rapidly. Within the first day, they established a structure of arbitrary rules, forcing prisoners to perform push-ups as punishment for minor infractions. They stripped prisoners naked and removed their mattresses. They conducted frequent head counts in the middle of the night, waking prisoners repeatedly to create exhaustion. The prisoners, in turn, reacted with rebellion. On the second day, the prisoners barricaded themselves in their cells using their beds, shouting insults at the guards. The guards responded with a coordinated show of force, using fire extinguishers to disperse the prisoners and forcing them to strip and clean the hallway with their bare hands. The rebellion was crushed, and the guards became increasingly sadistic in their methods. What followed was a systematic degradation of the prisoners. The guards began to use psychological torture techniques designed to strip the prisoners of their individuality and dignity. They forced prisoners to simulate sexual acts with one another. They refused prisoners permission to use the toilet and then punished them for soiling themselves. They created a system of privilege and favoritism, rewarding compliant prisoners with better food while punishing those who resisted with solitary confinement in the dark closet. The prisoners began to display signs of extreme emotional distress. Within days, several had breakdowns. One prisoner, identified as prisoner number 8612, began screaming uncontrollably, crying, and exhibiting symptoms of acute anxiety. He was released after 36 hours. Another prisoner developed a psychosomatic rash when the guards told him he would not be allowed to see the visiting psychologist who had come to evaluate him. A third prisoner went on a hunger strike, and the guards responded by force-feeding him and then confining him to solitary confinement for hours at a time. The guards, despite being selected for psychological stability, displayed behaviors that ranged from authoritarian to outright cruel. One guard later described that he had intentionally cultivated a persona of menace, striding through the prison with his baton and acting as though he were a brutal prison warden. Others followed his lead, competing to devise new humiliations for the prisoners. Remarkably, the abuses were not perpetrated by a single individual but emerged from the group dynamics of the guard unit. The researchers, including Zimbardo, became absorbed in the experiment to the extent that they lost objectivity. Zimbardo later admitted that he had begun to think of the prison as a real institution rather than a simulation, and that he was more concerned with the security of the facility than with the well-being of the participants. His graduate student, Christina Maslach, who was not originally part of the research team, visited the mock prison on the 5th night and was horrified by what she witnessed. She confronted Zimbardo, telling him that the experiment was causing unnecessary suffering and that he had allowed himself to become complicit in the cruelty. The following day, Zimbardo terminated the study. The Stanford Prison Experiment was intended to run for 14 days. It was halted after only 6. By that time, the psychological damage to the participants was evident. The prisoners had internalized their roles to the point that they exhibited learned helplessness, passively accepting abuse without resistance. The guards had demonstrated that ordinary, psychologically healthy young men could, under the right situational pressures, become perpetrators of cruelty. Zimbardo interpreted the results as evidence of the power of situational forces over individual disposition. He argued that the experiment demonstrated that the system itself, rather than the inherent character of the participants, was responsible for the abuses observed. In the decades following the experiment, its legacy became increasingly contested. Critics raised serious questions about the methodology and ethics of the study. The participants were young and impressionable, placed in an environment designed to induce stress and humiliation, and they had been explicitly told that they would not be allowed to leave voluntarily. Several participants later reported that they had endured lasting psychological effects. The experiment also came under scrutiny for the role of Zimbardo himself, who served not only as the principal investigator but also as the prison superintendent, blurring the lines between researcher and participant. Later archival research revealed that the guards had been instructed to create a sense of boredom and frustration among the prisoners, suggesting that the sadistic behaviors that emerged may have been influenced by implicit guidance from the research team rather than arising spontaneously from the situation. Despite these criticisms, the Stanford Prison Experiment has endured as a powerful cultural symbol. It has been referenced in legal proceedings, used in military training, and cited in countless textbooks as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the capacity for ordinary people to commit acts of cruelty when placed within oppressive systems. The experiment also contributed significantly to the evolution of ethical standards for psychological research. The American Psychological Association strengthened its guidelines regarding the treatment of human subjects in part because of the scrutiny generated by the Stanford Prison Experiment. Researchers today are required to ensure that participants can withdraw from a study at any time without penalty, and that the potential for psychological harm is minimized. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains a subject of intense debate. Some view it as a landmark study that revealed fundamental truths about human nature. Others see it as a deeply flawed and ethically compromised piece of research that overstated its conclusions. What is not disputed is the suffering experienced by the young men who served as prisoners. They entered the basement of Stanford as ordinary college students. They left in a state of distress, humiliation, and psychological injury. The experiment stands as a reminder that the line between research and harm can become dangerously blurred when the pursuit of knowledge overrides the duty of care owed to human subjects. The Monster Study. In the winter of 1939, at the University of Iowa, a speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson embarked upon an experiment that would later be known by a name that reflects its enduring infamy, the Monster Study. Johnson, who himself struggled with a severe stutter, had dedicated his career to understanding the origins and treatment of speech disorders. He was a leading figure in the field of speech pathology, and his work was influential in shaping how stuttering was understood and treated. The experiment he designed was intended to test a specific hypothesis: that stuttering was not an innate physiological condition but rather a learned behavior, one that could be induced or prevented through the power of suggestion and environmental feedback. To test this hypothesis, Johnson and his graduate student, Mary Tudor, selected 22 orphan children from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans' Home in Davenport, Iowa. The children ranged in age from 5 to 15 years old. None of them had been diagnosed with any speech disorder prior to the experiment. What Johnson and Tudor did to these children over the course of several months would cause lasting psychological damage and would become one of the most ethically condemned studies in the history of psychology. The experiment divided the children into two main groups. The first group consisted of 10 children who were identified as stutterers. They were further subdivided. 5 were given positive reinforcement for their speech, while the other 5 were subjected to negative criticism. The second group, which was the focus of the study's most damaging interventions, consisted of 12 children who were considered normal speakers with no history of stuttering. These children were also divided. 6 of them were placed in what Tudor called the positive group. They were told that their speech was excellent, that they spoke clearly and well, and that they had nothing to worry about. The remaining 6 children were placed in the negative group. These children were subjected to a systematic campaign of criticism designed to convince them that they were developing speech defects. tutor told them repeatedly that they stuttered. She told them that their speech was halting and broken. She instructed them to stop and think before speaking, warning them that if they did not carefully control their words, their speech would become worse. She reinforced these criticisms with constant reminders that they were failing to speak correctly. The sessions were conducted regularly over a period of several months. The children in the negative group were taken aside and subjected to these criticisms in private, often being told that their speech was deteriorating and that they needed to work harder to avoid becoming full-blown stutterers. They were praised when they spoke hesitantly, reinforcing the very behavior that was being criticized. The psychological pressure placed on these children was immense. They were orphans, living in an institution without the stability and protection of a family. They had no parents to advocate for them, no external support system to counter the messages they were receiving from the authority figures at the university. They believed what they were told. If the researchers said they were developing a stutter, then it must be true. The results of the experiment were devastating. The 6 children in the negative group, all of whom had entered the study with normal speech, began to exhibit the very behaviors they had been told they possessed. They became hesitant and self-conscious about their speech. They developed repetitions, prolongations, and blocks. They began to speak in short, halting phrases, afraid to complete a sentence for fear of being criticized. They withdrew from social interaction. They displayed signs of anxiety, embarrassment, and shame when asked to speak. Some of them stopped speaking altogether. The effects were not merely temporary. For several of these children, the speech problems induced by the experiment persisted for the rest of their lives. The children in the positive group, by contrast, showed improvement in their speech and exhibited no signs of psychological distress related to the experiment. The stuttering children in the study also suffered significant harm. Those who were subjected to negative criticism experienced a worsening of their existing stutter, as well as increased anxiety and self-consciousness about their speech. Those who received positive reinforcement showed improvement, demonstrating that encouragement and support were far more effective than criticism in helping children manage speech difficulties. But the most egregious harm was reserved for the normal-speaking children who were deliberately convinced that they were becoming stutterers. Johnson and Tudor had succeeded in proving that stuttering could be induced through suggestion. They had done so at the cost of permanently damaging the speech and psychological well-being of 6 orphan children. The experiment was never published in any academic journal. Johnson, who was a respected figure in his field, seemed to recognize the ethical implications of what had been done. The study was discussed within the University of Iowa Speech Pathology Department, but it was not shared with the broader academic community. Mary Tudor completed her master's thesis on the experiment in 1939, and the thesis sat in the university archives for more than 60 years, largely unknown to the public. Johnson continued his career, becoming a prominent author and researcher, and his work on stuttering remained influential. But the monster study remained hidden, a dark secret buried in the files of the university. It was not until the early 2000s that the study came to light. Investigative journalists and researchers uncovered the details of the experiment and began to publicize what had been done. The term monster study emerged from these investigations, coined by journalists who were horrified by the callousness of the research. The revelation of the study sparked a wave of public outrage. The state of Iowa, which had funded the university and the orphanage, faced questions about how such a study could have been permitted. The surviving participants, now elderly adults, began to speak about the long-term effects of the experiment. One of them, a woman who had been 5 years old at the time of the study, described how she had lived her entire life with a speech impediment that she had never had before the experiment. She described the shame and frustration of being unable to speak without hesitation, of being labeled a stutterer, of having her entire life shaped by the words that researchers had planted in her mind as a child. Other survivors told similar stories. They described feeling betrayed by the researchers who had been trusted to help them, not to harm them. They described the lifelong struggle to overcome the damage that had been inflicted in the name of science. In 2001, the University of Iowa issued a formal apology for the monster study. The university acknowledged that the experiment had been unethical and that it had caused lasting harm to the children involved. The apology was delivered to the surviving participants and their families, and the university expressed deep regret for the suffering that had been caused. The university also established a scholarship fund for students with speech disorders, in an attempt to make some amends for the damage that had been done. But for the survivors, the apology, while meaningful, could not undo the decades of struggle they had endured. The damage to their speech and their self-confidence had been inflicted when they were most vulnerable, and it had shaped the course of their lives. The monster study remains one of the most chilling examples of research conducted without regard for the well-being of human subjects. It stands out not only for the harm it caused but for the calculated nature of the cruelty. The researchers were not studying a deadly disease or seeking a cure for a catastrophic illness. They were testing a theory about speech development, and they chose to test that theory on orphan children who had no one to protect them. They deliberately induced a disability in healthy children and then documented the results. The study serves as a stark reminder that ethical oversight in research exists precisely to prevent such abuses. It is a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of institutionalized children, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the moral obligation that researchers owe to those who place their trust in them. The monster study earned its name because it demonstrated that even well-intentioned scientists, operating without ethical constraints, can commit acts that inflict lifelong suffering on the most defenseless members of society. Milgram Obedience Experiment. In the summer of 1961, a young psychologist at Yale University named Stanley Milgram set out to answer a question that haunted the post-war world. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who had orchestrated the logistics of the Holocaust, was dominating headlines around the globe. Eichmann's defense had been simple and chilling. He was not a monster, he claimed. He was merely a man following orders. Milgram, who was Jewish and deeply affected by the magnitude of the Holocaust, wondered whether this defense could be true. Could ordinary people, simply by being placed in a situation where authority commanded them to harm another person, be compelled to act against their own conscience? To answer this question, Milgram designed an experiment that would become one of the most famous and controversial studies in the history of psychology. What he discovered would reveal a disturbing truth about human nature and would raise profound ethical questions that continue to resonate decades later. Milgram recruited volunteers through newspaper advertisements and direct mail solicitations. The advertisement promised payment of $4 for participating in a study on memory and learning at Yale University. The volunteers came from all walks of life. They were men aged 20 to 50, ranging from high school graduates to professionals, from postal clerks to engineers. They were ordinary Americans, and none of them had any idea what the experiment truly entailed. When they arrived at the laboratory, they were introduced to another participant, a pleasant middle-aged man who was, in reality, an actor employed by Milgram. The two were told that the study was investigating the effect of punishment on learning. They drew slips of paper to determine who would be the teacher and who would be the learner. The drawing was rigged. The volunteer was always assigned to be the teacher, and the actor was always assigned to be the learner. The teacher watched as the learner was strapped into a chair in an adjacent room and connected to electrodes. The teacher was then seated before an imposing machine. The machine had 30 switches arranged in a row, each labeled with a voltage level. The first switch was labeled 15 volts. The labels progressed upward, each increment representing 15 volts, until the final switch, which was labeled 450 volts. Beneath the voltage numbers were descriptions: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally, for the last two switches, danger, severe shock, and a simple XXX. The teacher was instructed to read a list of word pairs to the learner. Then test the learner's memory by reading the first word of each pair and asking for the matching word. For each incorrect answer, the teacher was to administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage by 15 volts for each successive error. The teacher was also told to announce the voltage level before each shock. The learner, of course, was not actually receiving any shocks. The apparatus was a prop, and the learner was a trained actor. But the teacher did not know this. As the experiment progressed, the learner began to react. At 75 volts, he grunted. At 120 volts, he complained loudly that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he cried out in desperation, "Experimenter, that's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out." At 180 volts, he cried out that he could not stand the pain. At 270 volts, his response became an agonized scream. At 300 volts, he refused to answer any further questions, shouting in apparent agony. At 330 volts, there was silence. The teacher was instructed that silence was to be treated as an incorrect answer, requiring the next shock. Throughout the experiment, if the teacher hesitated or expressed a desire to stop, the experimenter, dressed in a gray lab coat, would issue a series of standardized prods. "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on." Milgram did not expect that many participants would go very far. He had surveyed a group of psychologists, asking them to predict how many people would administer the maximum 450-volt shock. The psychologists predicted that only about 1 to 2% of participants would do so. They were wrong. In the original version of the experiment, 65% of participants continued to the very end. They pressed the switch marked 450 volts, labeled XXX, while the learner, who had fallen silent long before, gave no response at all. These were not sadists or sociopaths. They were ordinary men who had answered a newspaper advertisement. They expressed distress throughout the experiment. They sweated. They trembled. They laughed nervously. They begged the experimenter to allow them to stop. Some bit their lips until they bled. One participant suffered a full-blown seizure. Yet they continued because a man in a white lab coat told them they must. Milgram conducted multiple variations of the experiment to understand the conditions that influenced obedience. When the experiment was conducted in a rundown office building rather than the prestigious Yale laboratory, obedience dropped, though still remained substantial. When the experimenter gave instructions over the telephone rather than in person, participants frequently cheated, administering lower shocks than instructed, and obedience dropped to around 20%. When the teacher was required to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience dropped dramatically. When two other teachers, who were actually actors, refused to continue, most participants followed their lead and also refused. The presence of dissent, Milgram found, was a powerful check on obedience. Conversely, when the learner himself begged to stop, it made little difference as long as the experimenter continued to give commands. Milgram's findings were met with shock and disbelief when they were published. The idea that the majority of ordinary Americans would willingly administer what they believed to be potentially fatal electric shocks to a stranger was deeply unsettling. Milgram argued that his experiment revealed a fundamental aspect of human social behavior, the tendency to enter an agentic state, in which individuals see themselves as agents carrying out the wishes of an authority figure rather than as autonomous moral agents responsible for their own actions. He argued that this tendency was so powerful that it could override deeply held moral values, including the prohibition against causing harm to another person. The experiment seemed to confirm that the Eichmann defense was not merely a convenient excuse but reflected a real psychological mechanism. Ordinary people, Milgram concluded, could be led to commit terrible acts simply by being placed in a situation where authority demanded it. The ethical implications of the Milgram experiment were fiercely debated from the moment it was published. Critics argued that the psychological stress inflicted on the participants was unacceptable. The participants believed they had caused severe harm to another person. Many of them were visibly traumatized during the experiment. Some reported lingering distress afterward. Milgram defended his methods, arguing that the participants were debriefed after the experiment and told that the shocks were fake and that the learner had not been harmed. He also conducted follow-up surveys, finding that the majority of participants were glad they had participated and did not regret their involvement. But critics pointed out that the debriefing could not undo the experience of believing, for a sustained period, that one was torturing another human being. The experiment contributed significantly to the development of modern ethical guidelines for psychological research, which now require that participants be fully informed of the nature of the study, that they be free to withdraw at any time without penalty, and that the risk of psychological harm be minimized. The Milgram Obedience Experiment remains one of the most cited and debated studies in the social sciences. Its findings have been replicated in various forms across different cultures and time periods, consistently showing that a substantial proportion of people will obey authority even when doing so appears to cause harm. The experiment has been invoked to explain a range of phenomena, from the behavior of soldiers in wartime to the misconduct of employees in corporate scandals. It has become a foundational text in the study of conformity, authority, and moral responsibility. But it also stands as a reminder that the pursuit of scientific knowledge can itself involve a form of obedience to authority. Milgram subjected his participants to intense psychological distress in the service of his research goals. The question of whether the knowledge gained justified the means remains a matter of debate to this day. What is beyond dispute is that the Milgram experiment revealed something profound and disturbing about the human capacity to set aside conscience in the presence of authority. It demonstrated that the line between ordinary people and perpetrators of harm is not as fixed as we would like to believe, and that under the right conditions, most of us are capable of actions we would never imagine ourselves committing. Little Albert Experiment. In 1920, at Johns Hopkins University, a psychologist named John B. Watson set out to prove a revolutionary theory. Watson was the founder of behaviorism, a school of thought that argued that human behavior could be explained entirely through conditioning and environmental factors, with no reference to internal mental states or innate instincts. He believed that fear, love, rage, and all other emotions were not inborn but were learned responses to stimuli in the environment. To demonstrate this, Watson and his graduate student, Rosalie Rayner, designed an experiment that would become one of the most famous and ethically troubling studies in the history of psychology. They selected a 9-month-old infant named Albert B., the son of a wet nurse who worked at the Harriet Lane Home for Invalid Children, a hospital affiliated with the university. The experiment they conducted would demonstrate the power of classical conditioning to create fear, but it would do so at the expense of a child who was never given the opportunity to undo the harm that had been inflicted upon him. Before the experiment began, Watson and Rayner conducted a series of baseline tests to determine what stimuli naturally elicited fear in Albert. They exposed him to a variety of objects: a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, masks with and without hair, burning newspapers, and a hammer striking a steel bar. At 9 months, Albert showed no fear of any of the animals or objects. He reached for the white rat with curiosity, touching it and attempting to play with it. The only stimulus that provoked a fearful response was the sudden loud noise of the hammer striking the steel bar. When the bar was struck, Albert would cry, his body would stiffen, and he would show signs of intense distress. This established that the loud noise was an unconditioned stimulus that naturally produced a fear response. Watson and Rayner now intended to condition Albert to fear the white rat by pairing the rat with the loud noise. The conditioning phase of the experiment began when Albert was 11 months and 3 days old. Watson placed the white rat in front of Albert, and as Albert reached out to touch it, Watson struck the steel bar with a hammer directly behind the child's head. Albert responded with a violent startle, his body jerking, his head falling forward, and his arms flailing. He did not cry at this first pairing, but he did not reach for the rat again. A week later, the procedure was repeated. The rat was presented, and as Albert reached for it, the hammer struck the bar. This time, Albert began to whimper. On the third pairing, Albert showed clear distress at the sight of the rat even before the noise was made. He began to cry and attempted to crawl away from the rat. By the fifth pairing, the conditioning was complete. Albert would cry and show intense fear at the mere sight of the white rat, even when the noise was not presented. Watson and Rayner then tested whether the conditioned fear would generalize to other stimuli. They presented Albert with a variety of white and furry objects. He reacted with fear to a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, a Santa Claus mask with a white beard, and even to Watson's own head of white hair. When presented with a set of wooden blocks, which he had previously played with without fear, he showed no distress. The fear was specific to objects that were white and furry, demonstrating that the conditioned response had generalized along the dimensions of the original conditioned stimulus. Albert, who had once been a curious and unafraid child, had been transformed into a child who cried and attempted to flee at the sight of anything white and fuzzy. The experiment was never completed in the way Watson had intended. He had planned to conduct a series of additional experiments to test methods of extinguishing the conditioned fears, but Albert was removed from the hospital by his mother before these procedures could be carried out. Watson and Reimer never had the opportunity to decondition the child. Albert left the study with a set of fears that had been artificially created and that were never reversed. The experiment was published in 1920 in the Journal of Experimental Psychology under the title Conditioned Emotional Reactions. In the paper, Watson made grand claims about the implications of his findings. He argued that the experiment demonstrated that emotional responses could be conditioned in humans and that this process could account for the development of phobias, anxieties, and other emotional disorders. He famously boasted that he could take any healthy infant and, through conditioning, shape them into any type of adult he chose, regardless of their innate talents or tendencies. For decades, the little Albert experiment was celebrated as a landmark demonstration of classical conditioning in humans. It was reproduced in countless textbooks, taught in introductory psychology courses around the world, and cited as evidence for the behaviorist view of human development. But questions about the identity of Albert and the fate of the child lingered for decades. Watson had not used Albert's real name in the publication, referring to him only as Albert B. The identity of the child remained a mystery until 2009, when a team of researchers led by psychologist Hall Beck published a study that identified Albert B. as Douglas Merritt, the son of a wet nurse named Arvilla Merritt who worked at the Harriet Lane home. The researchers discovered that Douglas had been born on March 9, 1919, and that he had been 6 months old at the start of the experiment, not 9 months as Watson had reported. More disturbingly, the researchers found evidence that Douglas had suffered from hydrocephalus, a condition characterized by fluid accumulation in the brain, and that his neurological development had been impaired from birth. He died at the age of 6 on May 10, 1925, from hydrocephalus and related complications. The fact that Watson had selected a child with a known neurological condition for his experiment raised further ethical questions about the conduct of the research. The little Albert experiment became a focal point for discussions about research ethics. Even by the standards of the 1920s, the experiment raised troubling questions. Watson and Reimer had deliberately induced fear in a human infant without any therapeutic justification. They had not obtained informed consent from the child's mother, who reportedly did not understand the nature of the research. They had exposed the child to significant distress, causing him to cry and attempt to escape. And they had failed to reverse the conditioning before the child left the study, leaving him with fears that persisted indefinitely. The experiment was cited in later years as a primary example of the need for ethical oversight in research involving human subjects. The principles that would later be codified in the Nuremberg Code and the Belmont Report, informed consent, the right to withdraw, the minimization of harm, and the obligation to debrief participants, all stand in direct opposition to the methods employed by Watson and Reimer. The little Albert experiment also became the subject of ongoing historical and ethical debate. Some researchers have challenged the identification of Albert as Douglas Merritt, arguing that the evidence is circumstantial and that other children at the Harriet Lane home may have been the subject of the experiment. Others have argued that regardless of Albert's identity, the experiment represents a fundamental violation of ethical principles that cannot be justified by the knowledge it produced. The experiment demonstrated that fear could be conditioned in humans, a finding that has been replicated many times under ethical conditions that do not involve the deliberate infliction of distress on vulnerable subjects. The knowledge gained, critics argue, was not worth the cost to the child who was used as a subject. John B. Watson went on to have a successful career after leaving Johns Hopkins University. He entered the advertising industry, where he applied his knowledge of psychology to marketing and became a highly successful executive. He never returned to academic research. The little Albert experiment remained his most famous contribution to psychology, a study that simultaneously established the power of conditioning and demonstrated the ethical dangers of research conducted without constraints. For the child who served as the subject, the experiment was a brief chapter in a short life. For the field of psychology, it became a permanent reminder of the obligations that researchers owe to the human beings who participate in their studies. The experiment stands as a cautionary tale about the pursuit of knowledge at the expense of the vulnerable, and it continues to be studied not only for its scientific contributions but for the ethical questions it raises about the treatment of human subjects in research. The Aversion Project. The treatment was not a one-time procedure. Patients were subjected to multiple sessions over extended periods. They were isolated from the outside world, confined in psychiatric wards, and subjected to constant monitoring. The psychological effects were devastating. Men who entered the program as young conscripts, often in their late teens or early 20s, emerged traumatized, ashamed, and profoundly damaged. Some reported that the treatment caused them to develop severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Several attempted suicide during or after the treatment. Some succeeded. The treatment rarely succeeded in changing sexual orientation, as the researchers later admitted, but it succeeded in creating a population of men who were terrified of their own desires and who carried the psychological scars of the abuse for the rest of their lives. The Aversion Project was not an isolated initiative but part of a broader pattern of medical experimentation within the apartheid military. The same psychiatric institutions that conducted the aversion therapy also conducted research on chemical warfare agents, mind-altering substances, and other forms of experimental treatment on military personnel without their informed consent. The military medical establishment operated with virtually no oversight. The apartheid government had created a legal framework that insulated the military from civilian accountability, and researchers took advantage of this to conduct experiments that would never have been permitted in a democratic society. The patients in the Aversion Project had no recourse. They could not complain without exposing themselves to criminal prosecution for homosexuality. They could not leave the military without facing desertion charges. They were trapped in a system that treated them as both criminals and experimental subjects. The Aversion Project continued until the late 1980s, when international pressure on the apartheid regime began to increase and the military began to face scrutiny for its human rights abuses. By the time the program was shut down, hundreds of men had been subjected to aversion therapy and chemical castration. The exact number is unknown, because the records of the program were largely destroyed or sealed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in South Africa after the end of apartheid to investigate human rights abuses committed during the apartheid era, heard testimony from survivors of the Aversion Project. The commission documented the abuses in its final report, describing the treatment as a particularly cruel form of torture, and noting that it was conducted in the name of medical science. The commission also noted that the researchers had violated every principle of medical ethics, including the requirement for informed consent and the prohibition against cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. After the fall of apartheid, Dr. Aubrey Levin left South Africa and emigrated to Canada, where he obtained a license to practice medicine. For years, he continued to work as a psychiatrist, and his past in South Africa was not widely known. In the early 2000s, however, survivors of the Aversion Project began to speak publicly about their experiences, and the media began to investigate. The revelations about Levin's role in the project led to public outrage in Canada. In 2010, Levin was charged with sexual assault, fraud, and other offenses related to his treatment of patients in Canada, though those charges were not directly connected to his work in South Africa. The case drew renewed attention to the Aversion Project and to the question of accountability for the doctors who had conducted experiments under apartheid. The legacy of the Aversion Project is complex. For the survivors, the effects of the treatment have been lifelong. Many have struggled with intimate relationships with their sense of self-worth, and with the psychological aftermath of having been tortured by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences, demanding recognition and apology from the South African government. Others have remained silent, unable or unwilling to revisit the trauma. The South African government, through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, acknowledged that the abuses occurred, but no formal apology specifically for the Aversion Project has been issued, and no compensation has been provided to the survivors. The doctors who conducted the experiments have largely avoided accountability. No criminal prosecutions have been brought against them in South Africa. The Aversion Project stands as a stark example of how medical knowledge can be weaponized by the state. The project was not the work of fringe figures or rogue doctors. It was conducted by respected academics, funded by the military, and carried out in a major military hospital. It was supported by the legal framework of apartheid and by a psychiatric establishment that had pathologized homosexuality and viewed its eradication as a legitimate medical goal. The project demonstrates the dangers that arise when the state defines certain groups as undesirable and when medical professionals allow themselves to become instruments of state policy. It also demonstrates the particular vulnerability of conscripted soldiers, who have no choice about their service and who are subject to the absolute authority of military commanders. The Aversion Project is less well known than some of the other experiments on this list, particularly outside of South Africa, but it is no less significant. It represents a convergence of racism, homophobia, and authoritarianism that produced a system of medicalized torture. The men who were subjected to the treatment were told that they were sick and that the doctors were trying to cure them. They were given electric shocks to their genitals and injected with drugs that altered their bodies and minds. They were told that this was for their own good. The Aversion Project is a reminder that medical experimentation does not require a Nazi concentration camp or a Cold War government laboratory. It can happen in a military hospital, in a democratic country that has descended into authoritarianism, and it can happen to ordinary people who are stripped of their rights and their dignity. The project remains a cautionary tale about the capacity of medicine to do harm when it is divorced from ethical constraints and when the vulnerable are placed in the hands of those who have the power to define them as deviant and to treat them as subjects rather than as human beings. Operation Sea Spray. On the evening of September 26, 1950, the United States Navy conducted a secret biological warfare experiment over the city of San Francisco. Two naval vessels, the USS Ruff and the USS Banner, positioned themselves approximately 2 miles off the coast of the city. From these ships, military personnel released massive clouds of a bacterium known as Serratia marcescens into the air. The release was part of a larger program of biological weapons testing that the United States military conducted throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The goal of Operation Sea Spray was to determine how vulnerable American cities were to biological attack. The military wanted to understand how biological agents would disperse over urban areas, how far they would travel, and what concentration of bacteria would be required to effectively target a population. What made Operation Sea Spray particularly egregious was that it was conducted without the knowledge or consent of the residents of San Francisco. The people of the city were never told that they were being used as test subjects. They went about their daily lives while the military sprayed potentially harmful bacteria into the air they breathed. The bacterium selected for the experiment was Serratia marcescens. At the time, military officials and scientists believed that this particular bacterium was harmless to humans. It was known to produce a distinctive red pigment, which made it easy to track in laboratory testing, and it was commonly used in biological research as a marker organism. The military had used Serratia marcescens in previous tests, and the prevailing scientific opinion was that it did not cause disease in healthy individuals. This belief, however, was incorrect. While Serratia marcescens is not typically pathogenic in healthy individuals, it is an opportunistic pathogen that can cause serious infections in people with compromised immune systems. It can cause urinary tract infections, respiratory infections, endocarditis, and septicemia. The bacterium can also cause pneumonia and meningitis. The military either did not know this or chose to ignore the risks when they sprayed the bacterium over a city of nearly 800,000 people. The release was conducted using a system of balloons and spray devices designed to simulate the type of biological attack that the military feared might be used against the United States by a hostile power. The vessels released the bacteria over a wide area of San Francisco, and the wind carried the bacterial cloud across the city. The military had placed dozens of sampling devices throughout the city to measure the concentration and spread of the bacteria. These devices were placed on rooftops at ground level and in various neighborhoods across the metropolitan area. The sampling network allowed the military to track exactly how far the bacterium traveled and how long it remained viable in the environment. The data collected from the experiment was used to refine military models of biological warfare dispersal. The military considered the experiment a success. The people of San Francisco, however, experienced the experiment in a very different way. Shortly after the release, the city experienced a dramatic and unexplained increase in cases of a rare and serious urinary tract infection. Doctors in San Francisco began reporting patients who had contracted Serratia marcescens infections, often severe enough to require hospitalization. In some cases, the infections were fatal. The exact number of illnesses and deaths caused by Operation Sea Spray is unknown and remains a subject of dispute. The military did not track health outcomes during the experiment, and no effort was made to correlate the release of bacteria with the spike in infections that followed. What is known is that within weeks of the release, several patients in San Francisco hospitals were diagnosed with Serratia marcescens pneumonia and other infections. At least one death was directly linked to the bacterium. Some researchers have argued that the actual number of fatalities was higher, but the records are incomplete and the military destroyed much of the documentation related to the experiment in the years that followed. Operation Sea Spray was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger program of biological weapons testing that the United States military conducted across the country during the Cold War. The military released bacteria and chemical simulants over cities including New York, Chicago, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis. In New York City in 1966, the military released Bacillus globigii, another bacterium believed to be harmless, into the subway system. The bacteria were released from light bulbs dropped onto the tracks as trains passed, and the airflow created by the trains dispersed the bacteria throughout the subway network. The military also conducted tests in which they sprayed zinc cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent chemical tracer, over large portions of the country. The chemical was released from airplanes and ground-based generators, and it settled over cities, farms, and homes. The military tracked the spread of the chemical using sampling devices placed in public spaces, often without the knowledge of local residents or public health authorities. The goal of all these tests was the same: to understand how biological and chemical agents would behave in the real world and to develop defenses against potential attacks. The existence of Operation Sea Spray and the other biological weapons tests remained a secret for more than 20 years. The military classified the experiments and kept the documentation under tight security. It was not until the mid-1970s, when a series of congressional investigations began to uncover the extent of the military's domestic biological and chemical testing, that the truth began to emerge. In 1976, the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy, held hearings on the military's testing programs. During these hearings, the Army acknowledged that it had conducted more than 200 biological weapons tests in populated areas over a period of more than 2 decades. The Army also acknowledged that the testing had been conducted without the knowledge or consent of the people who were exposed. The hearings revealed that the military had tested biological agents in cities including San Francisco, New York, Chicago, and Minneapolis, as well as in many other locations across the country. When the revelations about Operation Sea Spray became public, there was widespread outrage. The people of San Francisco learned that they had been used as test subjects without their knowledge. They learned that the military had sprayed bacteria over their city, their homes, their schools, and their workplaces, all in the name of national security. They learned that people had become sick and that some had died as a result. The military's defense was that it believed the bacterium was harmless and that the tests were necessary to protect the country from biological attack. But critics pointed out that the military had not conducted any prior research to confirm that Serratia marcescens was safe for large-scale release over a civilian population. They argued that the military had placed the lives of thousands of people at risk without their consent, and that the testing represented a fundamental violation of the rights of American citizens. In the years following the revelations, survivors and family members of those who had died from Serratia marcescens infections sought accountability. Lawsuits were filed against the federal government seeking compensation for the illnesses and deaths caused by the testing. The government argued that it was immune from liability under the Fears Doctrine, a legal principle that bars members of the military from suing the government for injuries that arise out of military service. Some cases were dismissed on these grounds. Others were settled out of court. No senior military officials were ever held personally accountable for the decisions that led to Operation Sea Spray or the other biological weapons tests. The government issued no formal apology to the people of San Francisco for the experiment. Operation Sea Spray stands as a stark example of the dangers that arise when the military conducts secret experiments on civilian populations. The experiment was conducted in the name of national security, but it was carried out without oversight, without accountability, and without regard for the health and safety of the people who were exposed. The military viewed the residents of San Francisco as test subjects, not as citizens whose rights required protection. The experiment also demonstrates the limitations of the concept of harmless biological agents. The military's assumption that serratia marcescens was safe was based on incomplete science, and the consequences of that assumption were paid by the people who developed infections and by the families of those who died. Operation Sea Spray is a reminder that the use of human subjects in research does not require a laboratory or a hospital. It can happen on the streets of a major American city, with the government as the experimenter and the public as the unwitting subjects. The experiment remains one of the most egregious examples of government overreach in the name of scientific and military research, and it contributed to the growing demand for oversight and accountability in all forms of human subjects research, whether conducted by universities, hospitals, or the military. MKUltra. In 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a secret program that would become the most infamous mind control research initiative in American history. The program was called MKUltra. Its stated purpose was to develop techniques for interrogating captured spies and enemy operatives, methods that could break the human mind and extract information against the subject's will. But the ambitions of MKUltra went far beyond interrogation. The CIA wanted to create methods for controlling human behavior entirely. They sought a drug that could be administered without a subject's knowledge, that would dissolve the will, and that would allow the operator to implant suggestions or extract secrets. They sought techniques for inducing amnesia, creating programmed assassins, and turning enemy agents into double agents. For nearly 2 decades, the CIA pursued these goals with virtually no oversight, conducting experiments on unwitting American citizens, prisoners, patients, and even fellow government employees. The program was so secret that when it was finally exposed in the 1970s, the CIA's own records were found to have been systematically destroyed, leaving behind only fragments of evidence about the scope and scale of the abuses that had been committed. The central tool of MKUltra was LSD. The CIA had become aware of the powerful psychoactive effects of lysergic acid diethylamide in the early 1950s, and they believed that this drug might be the key to mind control. LSD could produce profound alterations in consciousness, breaking down a subject's sense of identity and making them highly suggestible. The CIA purchased massive quantities of LSD from the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company, often using front companies to conceal the purchases. They then set about testing the drug on human subjects. The testing took many forms. In some cases, the CIA recruited volunteers from prisons, hospitals, and universities, often under false pretenses. In other cases, the testing was conducted without the subject's knowledge at all. The CIA established safe houses in major American cities, including New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., where subjects were brought for extended sessions of drug administration and interrogation. The subjects were often prostitutes, drug addicts, and other marginalized individuals who could be exploited without raising questions. The CIA also conducted experiments on its own employees, sometimes slipping LSD into their drinks at office parties to observe the effects without warning. One of the most chilling aspects of MKUltra was the deliberate targeting of unwitting civilians. The CIA developed protocols for administering LSD to individuals without their knowledge, often through spiked drinks or food. The goal was to test whether the drug could be deployed as a covert weapon, incapacitating a target without their awareness. In one documented case, a CIA scientist named Frank Olson was given LSD without his knowledge during a retreat at a remote cabin in Maryland in 1953. Olson was a biochemist working for the Army's biological weapons program, and he had been invited to the retreat by his CIA handlers. Days after the dosing, Olson became severely depressed and was taken to New York City for psychiatric evaluation. On November 28, 1953, he fell or jumped from the window of his 10th-floor hotel room. The CIA initially told his family that Olson had died in a tragic accident. It was not until decades later that the truth of the LSD dosing emerged, and the family was forced to confront the fact that Frank Olson's death was a direct consequence of the CIA's reckless experimentation. The CIA also conducted MKUltra experiments through a network of collaborating institutions. The program provided funding to universities, hospitals, and research centers across the United States and Canada, channeling money through front organizations to conceal the source. Researchers at these institutions conducted experiments on patients, often without their knowledge or consent, using the CIA's protocols and reporting their findings back to the agency. At the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron conducted experiments funded by MKUltra that became some of the most notorious in the program's history. Cameron developed a technique he called psychic driving, which involved subjecting patients to repeated audio messages played for hours at a time, combined with massive doses of LSD and prolonged periods of electroconvulsive shock therapy. Cameron's patients, many of whom had sought treatment for relatively minor conditions such as anxiety or depression, were subjected to treatments that stripped them of their memories, their identities, and their capacity for independent thought. Some of them never recovered. Cameron's experiments were conducted with the full knowledge and funding of the CIA, which viewed his work as potentially providing the key to mind control. The scale of MKUltra was staggering. The program involved more than 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. It employed hundreds of researchers and funded more than 140 separate research projects. The CIA spent millions of dollars on the program over its 2 decades of operation, all of it hidden in the agency's secret budget. The subjects of MKUltra numbered in the thousands. They included prisoners, mental patients, drug addicts, prostitutes, and ordinary citizens who had the misfortune to cross paths with CIA operatives. In many cases, the subjects never knew that they had been part of an experiment. They were given drugs without their knowledge, subjected to interrogation techniques designed to break their minds, and then released back into society with no follow-up care and no explanation of what had happened to them. MKUltra was officially terminated in 1973. In that year, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all records related to the program. Helms had been involved in MKUltra since its early days, and he understood that the program's exposure would be catastrophic for the agency. The destruction of the files was systematic and thorough. Agency employees shredded documents, burned files, and disposed of records in any way that would ensure they could never be recovered. By the time the program was finally exposed, the vast majority of MKUltra's documentation was gone. What remained were fragments. Financial records that had not been destroyed, a few boxes of documents that had been misfiled, and the testimony of researchers and subjects who came forward when the story broke. The destruction of the records made it impossible to fully determine the scope of the program or to identify all of the individuals who had been subjected to experimentation without their consent. The exposure of MKUltra came in 1975, when the Church Committee, a United States Senate Select Committee chaired by Senator Frank Church, began investigating intelligence community abuses. The committee uncovered the existence of the program and held public hearings that revealed the extent of the CIA's domestic experimentation. The revelations were shocking to the American public. The idea that the CIA had been secretly dosing American citizens with LSD, conducting mind control experiments on unwitting subjects, and funding abusive research in psychiatric institutions was almost beyond belief. The Church Committee's investigation revealed that MKUltra had operated for 2 decades with virtually no oversight. The CIA had not informed the Congress, the President, or any other government body of the program's existence. The agency had simply gone about its work, experimenting on American citizens as if they were laboratory animals. In the aftermath of the Church Committee hearings, there were calls for accountability. Survivors of MKUltra, including the family of Frank Olson and the patients of Dr. Cameron, filed lawsuits against the CIA and the Canadian government. Some of these cases resulted in settlements, including a substantial payment to the Olson family and compensation to Cameron's former patients. But no CIA officials were ever prosecuted for their roles in MKUltra. The agency argued that the program had been terminated and that the individuals responsible were no longer with the agency. The destruction of the records made it difficult to assign individual responsibility, and the government's interest in protecting national security secrets provided a convenient shield against full accountability. MKUltra left a lasting legacy in American law and culture. The program was a primary catalyst for the creation of new oversight mechanisms for intelligence agencies. The Church Committee's findings led to the establishment of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which were charged with providing ongoing oversight of the intelligence community. New laws were passed requiring that the President be informed of all covert actions and that Congress be notified of intelligence activities. The program also led to the creation of new regulations governing human subjects research, reinforcing the principles of informed consent and independent review that had been established in the wake of the Nuremberg trials. The cultural impact of MKUltra has been profound. The program has become a touchstone for conspiracy theories and a symbol of government overreach. It has been referenced in films, television shows, and books, often serving as shorthand for the darkest possibilities of state power. For the survivors of MKUltra, however, the program was not a conspiracy theory. It was a lived reality. They endured the effects of LSD trips they never consented to, the destruction of their memories through electroshock, and the violation of their minds by researchers who viewed them as experimental material. They carried these scars for the rest of their lives, many of them never knowing the full truth of what had been done to them. MKUltra stands as the most extreme example of the dangers that arise when secret government agencies conduct human experimentation without oversight. It demonstrated that the line between scientific research and state-sponsored abuse can disappear entirely when there are no checks on power, and it serves as a permanent reminder of the need for transparency, accountability, and respect for the rights of all human subjects. The Tearoom Trade Study. In the mid-1960s, a graduate student in sociology at Washington University in St. Louis named Laud Humphreys began a research project that would become one of the most controversial studies in the history of the social sciences. Humphreys was interested in a subject that was almost entirely invisible to mainstream society: anonymous homosexual encounters in public restrooms. At the time, homosexual acts were illegal in every state except Illinois, and men who engaged in same-sex behavior faced the constant threat of arrest, public exposure, and the destruction of their careers and families. Despite this, Humphreys discovered that there was a hidden world of men who met in public toilets, known in the vernacular of the time as Tearooms, for brief, anonymous sexual encounters. These men came from all walks of life. Some were openly gay, but many were married, had children, held respectable jobs, and presented themselves to the world as heterosexual. Humphreys wanted to understand who these men were, why they took the risks they did, and how they managed to maintain their public identities while engaging in secret behavior. The methods he used to answer these questions would raise profound ethical issues that continue to be debated to this day. Humphreys began his research by inserting himself into the tearoom scene. He identified a public restroom in a park in St. Louis that was known as a site for homosexual encounters. He began visiting the restroom regularly, but he did not participate in the sexual activities. Instead, he took on the role of what was known in the subculture as a watch queen, a lookout who would warn the men if police or strangers approached. By assuming this role, Humphreys gained the trust of the men who used the tearoom. They accepted his presence as a protective measure, and they did not realize that he was a researcher who was observing and documenting their behavior. Over a period of several months, Humphreys observed hundreds of encounters. He recorded detailed notes about the men's behaviors, their interactions, and the rituals that governed the tearoom culture. He also recorded the license plate numbers of the cars driven by the men who visited the restroom. The observation phase of the study was already ethically fraught. Humphreys was conducting covert research on men who were engaged in illegal activities, observing them without their knowledge or consent. But the next phase of his research was far more invasive. Using the license plate numbers he had recorded, Humphreys obtained the names and addresses of the men from the Missouri Department of Motor Vehicles. He then waited a full year after his observation period to ensure that he would not be recognized as the watch queen from the tearoom. He then visited each man at his home, presenting himself as a researcher conducting a general sociological survey. He did not reveal that he knew anything about the men's sexual activities. He asked them standard demographic questions about their occupations, marriages, families, and social lives. He also asked them about their political views, their religious affiliations, and their attitudes toward homosexuality. The men, believing they were participating in an anonymous survey about their communities, answered his questions freely. Humphreys then matched their responses to the behavioral data he had collected in the Tearoom, creating a detailed portrait of men who engaged in anonymous homosexual encounters while leading otherwise conventional lives. The findings of Humphreys's research were published in 1970 in a book titled Tearoom Trade: Impersonal Sex in Public Places. The book was a landmark study in the sociology of deviance. Humphreys argued that the men he studied were not a homogeneous group. He identified several distinct categories, including men who were openly gay, men who were closeted but identified as homosexual, and a significant group of men who did not identify as homosexual at all but who engaged in the behavior as a form of sexual release outside of their heterosexual marriages. He found that many of these men held positions of authority in their communities. They were policemen, clergymen, teachers, and businessmen. They were often politically conservative and vocally anti-homosexual in their public statements. Humphreys argued that the Tearoom provided a way for these men to reconcile their sexual desires with their social roles, allowing them to maintain their public identities while satisfying needs that could not be met within their marriages. The book was widely praised for its insights into the complexities of sexual identity and for its challenge to stereotypes about homosexual men. But even as the book was being celebrated, questions were being raised about the ethics of the research. Humphreys had conducted his study without the informed consent of any of his subjects. The men in the Tearoom did not know they were being observed. The men he visited at home did not know that he had tracked them down using their license plate numbers or that he was linking their survey responses to observations of their sexual behavior. They had no opportunity to refuse to participate in the study because they were never told that they were participants at all. Humphreys had deceived the men about his identity, his purpose, and the nature of his research. He had violated their privacy in the most intimate ways possible, documenting their illegal sexual activities and then using government records to track them to their homes. He had potentially exposed them to the risk of arrest, public exposure, and personal ruin if his research notes had ever been subpoenaed or if his methods had become known before the men had the chance to protect themselves. The ethical issues raised by the Tearoom trade study became the subject of intense debate within the sociological community. Defenders of Humphreys argued that his research was valuable and that traditional methods of informed consent would have been impossible because the subjects were engaged in illegal behavior. They argued that if Humphreys had asked the men for permission to study them, they would have refused, and the knowledge contained in Tearoom trade would have been lost. They also argued that Humphreys had taken precautions to protect the identities of his subjects, using pseudonyms and carefully guarding his research records. Critics responded that the value of the knowledge did not justify the methods used to obtain it. They argued that the men had a right to privacy that Humphreys had violated, and that the potential harm to the subjects, including the risk of arrest, divorce, loss of employment, and social ostracism, far outweighed any possible benefits of the research. They also noted that Humphreys had not simply observed the men. He had actively deceived them, using the cover of a general social survey to extract information they would never have shared if they had known his true purpose. The Tearoom trade study had significant consequences for the field of sociology and for the regulation of human subjects research. In the years following the study's publication, the American Sociological Association and other professional organizations strengthened their ethical guidelines regarding the use of human subjects. The study was frequently cited as a cautionary example of the dangers of covert research and the importance of informed consent. Institutional review boards, which were becoming increasingly common in universities during the 1970s, began to scrutinize research involving vulnerable populations and illegal activities much more carefully. Humphreys's work became a test case for the limits of acceptable research methods, and it remains a central text in discussions of research ethics to this day. Laud Humphreys himself faced professional consequences for his research. The controversy surrounding the Tearoom trade study made him a polarizing figure in sociology. He was hired at Loyola University in Chicago, but the controversy followed him. In 1973, the president of Loyola, a Catholic university, attempted to have Humphreys fired after learning about the study. The faculty fought for his tenure, and he was ultimately retained, but the controversy took a toll on his career. He continued to teach and write, but he was often marginalized within the profession. He died in 1988 at the age of 57. For the men who were the subjects of the Tearoom trade study, the consequences of Humphreys's research are impossible to fully assess. None of them ever came forward publicly to complain about their participation, and Humphreys's records were destroyed after his death. But the ethical violation remains. These men were studied without their knowledge, deceived about the nature of the research, and exposed to risks they never consented to take. They were treated as sources of data rather than as human beings with rights to privacy and autonomy. The Tearoom trade study stands as a landmark in the debate over the ethics of social science research. It demonstrates that the subjects of sociological research are not merely abstract cases but real people whose lives can be profoundly affected by the actions of researchers. It also demonstrates that the pursuit of knowledge, no matter how valuable that knowledge may seem, cannot justify the violation of fundamental ethical principles. The men in the Tearooms of St. Louis were engaging in behavior that was illegal and stigmatized. They had powerful reasons to keep their activities secret. Humphreys, in his determination to study them, disregarded those reasons and exposed them to risks that were not theirs to assume. The Tearoom trade study remains a powerful reminder of the obligations that researchers owe to the people they study, and of the ethical limits that must constrain even the most ambitious scientific inquiry. The David Reimer case. In August 1965, a Canadian woman gave birth to twin boys in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The boys, whom the parents named Bruce and Brian, were healthy and developed normally through their early infancy. When they were 7 months old, their parents took them to a pediatrician for a routine circumcision. The procedure on Bruce went tragically wrong. The physician performing the circumcision used a technique called electrocautery, which employs an electric current to cut tissue and seal blood vessels. The device malfunctioned, and the electric current was far too high. Bruce's penis was effectively destroyed. The burns were so severe that the organ was beyond surgical repair. The parents were told that their son would never have normal sexual function, that he would be unable to urinate standing up, and that he would face a lifetime of physical and psychological challenges. They were devastated. They sought help from medical experts, desperate to find a solution that would allow their son to live a normal life. The couple eventually encountered Dr. John Money, a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Money was one of the most prominent sexologists of his time. He had built his reputation on the study of sexual development and gender identity, and he had become a leading advocate for a particular theory, that gender identity was not innate but was entirely a product of social conditioning. Money argued that infants were born as a blank slate, psychologically neutral, and that their sense of being male or female was shaped entirely by how they were raised. He believed that if a child with a damaged penis were raised as a girl, she would develop a normal female gender identity without any psychological conflict. Bruce's case, Money recognized, presented an opportunity to prove his theory definitively. Money met with Bruce's parents and presented them with a proposal. He told them that the best course of action was to raise Bruce as a girl. He recommended surgical removal of the damaged testicles, which would prevent the development of male puberty, and the construction of a rudimentary vagina. He told the parents that if they followed his plan, their child would grow up to be a normal, well-adjusted woman, able to marry and have a fulfilling life. The parents, desperate to give their child a future, agreed. Bruce's testicles were removed, and he was given a new name, Brenda. The family returned to Winnipeg, and they began raising Brenda as a girl. They dressed her in feminine clothing, gave her dolls to play with, and encouraged her to adopt feminine behaviors. Money, meanwhile, published reports in medical journals describing the case as a complete success. He presented Brenda as proof of his theory, writing that the child was developing into a normal, happy girl who showed no signs of the traumatic origin of her gender reassignment. What Money did not disclose in his publications was that the reality of Brenda's life was entirely different from the picture he painted. From the very beginning, Brenda resisted being raised as a girl. She rejected feminine clothing, preferring to dress in her brother Brian's clothes. She preferred toys that were traditionally masculine, such as trucks and tools. She insisted on standing up to urinate, despite the physical impossibility. She was aggressive and assertive, and she consistently identified herself as male. Throughout her childhood, she was tormented by other children, who sensed that she was different and mocked her relentlessly. Her parents, following Money's instructions, continued to reinforce the female identity, but they were increasingly distressed by the conflict they saw in their child. Brenda began to act out in destructive ways. She refused to cooperate with the monthly visits to Baltimore, where Money would conduct sessions designed to reinforce her female identity. In these sessions, Money would show Brenda and Brian pictures of nude children and adults, asking them to identify sexual characteristics. He would encourage them to engage in sexual play with each other, positioning them in ways that simulated intercourse. The children were disturbed by these sessions, but they were told that this was part of the treatment that would help Brenda become a normal girl. As Brenda entered adolescence, the situation became unbearable. She was given estrogen to induce female puberty, which caused her to develop breasts. This was deeply distressing to her. She became suicidal. She refused to continue the treatments. When she was 14 years old, her parents finally told her the truth about her infancy. They told her that she had been born a boy, that her penis had been destroyed in a circumcision accident, and that she had been surgically altered and raised as a girl. For Brenda, this revelation was not a shock but a relief. It confirmed what she had always felt to be true. She immediately stopped living as a female. She cut her hair, changed her name to David, and began living as a male. He underwent a series of surgeries to reconstruct a penis, and he began taking testosterone to induce male puberty. He eventually married a woman and became a stepfather to her children. David Reimer's story might have remained a private tragedy if not for a chance encounter. In 1997, the writer John Colapinto was researching a story about gender identity for a magazine. He discovered the case of John/Joan, as it had been known in the medical literature, and he set out to find the adult who had been the subject of Money's famous experiment. Colapinto located David Reimer, who agreed to tell his story publicly. The resulting article, and the subsequent book titled As Nature Made Him, revealed the full extent of the deception that had been perpetrated. The world learned that Money's famous case study had been a fabrication. David had never been happy as a female. He had never adjusted to his assigned gender. The experiment had failed completely, and Money had hidden the failure for decades while continuing to promote his theory, and while other physicians, influenced by his work, performed similar gender reassignments on other children with damaged genitals. The revelation of the truth had devastating consequences. David's twin brother Brian, who had struggled with mental health issues throughout his life, died of a drug overdose in 2002. David himself suffered from severe depression, unemployment, and financial difficulties. He had difficulty maintaining relationships, and his marriage eventually ended. On May 4, 2004, David Reimer died by suicide at the age of 38. He left behind a story that had been defined by the experiment conducted upon him without his consent, an experiment that had taken his body, his identity, and his childhood, and that had shaped the entire trajectory of his life. The David Reimer case stands as one of the most devastating examples of the harm that can be inflicted when a researcher treats a human being as a test subject in an experiment designed to prove a theory. John Money had not set out to help David. He had set out to prove that gender identity was malleable, and he had used David's tragedy as his evidence. When the evidence contradicted his theory, he suppressed it, continuing to publish false claims that influenced medical practice for more than a generation. David's suffering was compounded by the fact that his body had been surgically altered without his consent, that his childhood had been shaped by a series of deceptions, and that his psychological distress had been dismissed as resistance to a treatment that was supposedly in his best interest. The case had a profound impact on medical ethics and on the treatment of children with disorders of sexual development. It led to a re-examination of the practice of performing irreversible genital surgery on infants without their consent. Many medical institutions changed their protocols, delaying such surgeries until the child is old enough to participate in the decision. It also served as a powerful refutation of the theory that gender identity is purely a product of social conditioning. David Reimer's story provided compelling evidence that there is a biological component to gender identity that cannot be overridden by social factors. This insight has shaped the understanding of gender identity in the decades since. David Reimer's life was defined by an experiment that should never have happened. He was an infant when the decision was made to use his body as a test case for a psychological theory. He was a child when he was subjected to treatments that were designed to fit him into a mold that did not match who he was. He was an adult when the truth of his story finally came to light. Throughout it all, he was a human being who deserved to have his own identity respected, his own voice heard, and his own body left intact. The experiment that John Money conducted on David Reimer was not an isolated case of research gone wrong. It was a deliberate and sustained effort to shape a human life to fit a theory, conducted without regard for the welfare of the child who was the subject. It stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of scientific hubris, the vulnerability of children in medical settings, and the fundamental right of every person to self-determination. The case is a permanent reminder that no theory, no matter how influential its advocate, is worth the destruction of a human life. Radiation experiments on children. In the decades following World War II, the United States government conducted a series of secret experiments involving the exposure of human subjects to radiation. These experiments were carried out in hospitals, universities, and research institutions across the country, often with the knowledge and cooperation of some of the nation's most respected medical and scientific establishments. Among the most disturbing of these experiments were those conducted on children. The subjects were often institutionalized children, children with mental disabilities, or children from poor families who were treated as expendable research material. The experiments were conducted without the informed consent of the children or their parents, and they exposed vulnerable young bodies to radiation that researchers knew, or should have known, posed significant risks to their health. When these experiments were finally exposed decades later, they revealed a pattern of government-sponsored abuse that shocked the nation and led to demands for accountability that continued for years. One of the most notorious of these experiments was conducted at the Fernald State School in Waltham, Massachusetts. The Fernald School was a state-run institution for children with mental disabilities. Between 1946 and 1953, researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in cooperation with the Atomic Energy Commission, conducted a series of radiation experiments on the boys who lived at the school. The experiments were designed to study the absorption and metabolism of calcium and iron in the human body. The researchers believed that understanding how these minerals were processed could provide valuable information about nutrition and about the effects of radioactive fallout. To conduct the study, they fed the boys breakfast cereals that had been laced with radioactive tracers. The tracers included radioactive iron and radioactive calcium. The researchers then collected samples of the boys' blood, urine, and feces to measure how much of the radioactive material was absorbed by their bodies. The boys at Fernald were not told that they were being fed radioactive substances. Their parents were not informed. The researchers presented the program to the institution's administrators as a nutritional study, a scientific club that would provide the boys with special meals and medical attention. The boys were invited to join the science club, and they were given small incentives such as comic books, toys, and trips into Boston. They were told that they were participating in a study that would help them and other children. They were not told that the cereal they were eating contained radioactive isotopes. The amounts of radiation administered to the boys varied. In some cases, the doses were relatively low. In other cases, they were significantly higher. The researchers deliberately selected children who were institutionalized because they were a captive population. They could be monitored continuously, and there was little risk that parents would ask questions or object to the procedures. The Fernald experiments were not an isolated case. Similar experiments were conducted on children at other institutions across the country. At the Walter E. Fernald State School, at the Sonoma State Home in California, and at other institutions for the mentally disabled, researchers administered radioactive substances to children without their knowledge or consent. At the University of Chicago, researchers fed radioactive milk to institutionalized children. At Vanderbilt University, pregnant women were given radioactive iron to study how the element crossed the placenta, exposing their unborn children to radiation. At the University of Cincinnati, researchers exposed cancer patients, including children, to total body radiation in experiments designed to study the effects of radiation on the human body. In many of these cases, the subjects were not told that they were being used as experimental subjects, and they were not given any choice about their participation. The rationale provided by the researchers for these experiments was that they were necessary for national security. The Cold War had created an intense interest in the effects of radiation on the human body. The United States was conducting atmospheric nuclear weapons tests, and there was concern about the effects of radioactive fallout on the population. Researchers argued that they needed to understand how the body absorbed and processed radioactive materials in order to set safety standards and to develop treatments for radiation exposure. But the experiments themselves were conducted on populations that were chosen precisely because they were unable to defend themselves. Institutionalized children, prisoners, and the poor were disproportionately represented in the radiation experiments because they were available, because they could be monitored, and because they were unlikely to complain or to have their objections taken seriously. The experiments continued for decades. By the time they were exposed in the 1990s, thousands of Americans had been subjected to radiation exposure as part of government-sponsored research. Many of them had been children at the time. Some had suffered immediate health effects. Others developed cancers and other diseases later in life that may have been linked to their exposure. But because the experiments had been conducted in secret, and because the records were often incomplete, it was impossible to determine the full extent of the harm that had been caused. The government had not tracked the health outcomes of the subjects. There was no system of follow-up care. The children who had been fed radioactive cereal at Fernald grew up, left the institution, and went on with their lives, unaware that they had been part of an experiment that might have affected their health. The exposure of the radiation experiments came in 1993, when the Albuquerque Tribune published a series of articles revealing that the government had conducted experiments involving the injection of plutonium into human subjects at a hospital in Rochester, New York. The articles triggered a wave of investigative journalism, and soon other experiments began to come to light. The Department of Energy, which had inherited many of the records from the Atomic Energy Commission, was forced to acknowledge that it had sponsored hundreds of radiation experiments on human subjects between 1944 and 1974. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments was established to investigate the scope of the experiments and to make recommendations for accountability and redress. The committee's final report, published in 1995, documented dozens of experiments on children and concluded that many of them had been conducted without adequate informed consent and in violation of the ethical standards of their time. The report was devastating in its detail. It described how researchers had fed radioactive oatmeal to boys at Fernald, how they had injected radioactive materials into children at other institutions, and how they had exposed children to total body radiation without any therapeutic justification. The report noted that in many cases, the parents of the children had been told that their children were receiving special treatments or nutritional supplements without being informed that these treatments involved radiation. The committee found that the researchers had been more concerned with the scientific value of their experiments than with the welfare of their subjects. They had treated institutionalized children as convenient research material, assuming that the benefits to science justified the risks to the subjects. The revelations led to a series of apologies and settlements. President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the survivors of the radiation experiments in 1995, acknowledging that the government had failed to live up to its ethical obligations. He established an advisory committee to review the cases and to make recommendations for compensation. Some of the survivors, including many of the former Fernald boys, filed lawsuits against the state of Massachusetts and the federal government. In 1998, the government agreed to a settlement that provided compensation to the Fernald subjects and their families. The settlement included an acknowledgement that the experiments had been unethical and that the subjects had been wronged. Similar settlements were reached with other victims of the radiation experiments, though many went uncompensated because the records were incomplete or because they had died before the truth came to light. The radiation experiments on children stand as one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of American medical research. They reveal a system in which the vulnerable were routinely exploited in the name of science and national security. The children who were subjected to these experiments were not patients who consented to treatment. They were inmates of institutions, wards of the state, children whose parents had been told that the institution would care for them. Instead of care, they received radioactive cereal. Instead of protection, they received exposure to substances that researchers themselves were uncertain about. The experiments were conducted in plain sight, at major universities and hospitals, with the cooperation of prominent scientists and the funding of the federal government. They were not secret because they were hidden. They were secret because no one asked what was being done to the children, and the researchers did not volunteer the information. The legacy of the radiation experiments is complex. They contributed to the development of modern radiation safety standards, though the knowledge was obtained at a terrible cost. They also contributed to the strengthening of ethical oversight for research involving human subjects. The experiments helped to galvanize the movement for institutional review boards and for the requirement of informed consent that is now standard in all human subjects research. But for the children who were the subjects of the experiments, the legacy is one of betrayal. They were denied the right to decide what happened to their own bodies. They were denied the information that would have allowed them to protect themselves. They were treated as objects, not as persons, by researchers who should have known better. The radiation experiments on children remain a reminder that the most vulnerable members of society require the strongest protections, and that the pursuit of scientific knowledge must never come at the expense of basic human dignity. They stand as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of transparency in research, and the enduring obligation of society to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The Robbers' Cave Experiment. In the summer of 1954, a social psychologist named Muzafer Sharif set out to test a theory about the origins of conflict and cooperation between groups. Sharif, who had fled Nazi Germany and established himself as a prominent figure in American psychology, was interested in a question that had profound implications for understanding prejudice, war, and social harmony. He wanted to know whether conflict between groups arose from deep-seated personality traits, from innate prejudices, or from something else entirely. His hypothesis was that conflict was not inherent in human nature but emerged from competition over limited resources. He believed that if groups were forced to compete for scarce rewards, they would develop hostility toward one another, and that this hostility could be reduced only by creating situations that required cooperation toward shared goals. To test this hypothesis, Sharif designed an experiment that would become one of the most famous studies in the history of social psychology: the Robbers' Cave Experiment. The experiment took place at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, a remote and rugged location that provided isolation from outside influences. Sharif and his research team selected 22 boys, all 11 years old, all white, all from stable middle-class families, and all with no history of behavioral or emotional problems. The boys were carefully screened to ensure that they were psychologically healthy and that they did not know one another before the experiment began. They were told that they were attending a summer camp, a typical boys' camp where they would engage in outdoor activities, swimming, hiking, and camping. They were not told that they were part of an experiment. The researchers, posing as camp staff, observed the boys constantly, recording their interactions, their friendships, and their behaviors. The experiment was divided into 3 distinct phases, each designed to test a different aspect of Sharif's theory. In the first phase, the boys arrived at the camp in 2 separate groups. They were transported to the camp on different days and housed in separate cabins, several hundred yards apart. Neither group knew that the other existed. During this phase, the researchers encouraged the boys to bond with their own group members. They engaged in activities that required cooperation, such as setting up camp, cooking meals together, and working together to overcome minor challenges. The boys formed friendships within their groups, developed group identities, and began to adopt names for themselves. One group called themselves the Rattlers. The other group called themselves the Eagles. They developed their own internal hierarchies, their own norms, and their own sense of group pride. By the end of this phase, the 2 groups had formed strong bonds and were unaware that there was another group of boys just a short distance away. In the second phase, the researchers introduced the 2 groups to each other and created conditions of competition. The Rattlers and the Eagles were brought together for the first time, and they were informed that they would be participating in a tournament. The tournament included baseball games, tug-of-war contests, treasure hunts, and other competitive activities. The winning team would receive trophies, medals, and other desirable prizes. The losing team would receive nothing. The researchers deliberately structured the competition so that resources were scarce. Only one group could win the prizes. Only one group could claim victory. Almost immediately, the atmosphere between the groups turned hostile. The boys began to taunt and insult one another. The Rattlers and the Eagles developed derogatory nicknames for each other. They engaged in name-calling, shouting, and threatening gestures. The competition escalated rapidly. The Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, overturning beds and stealing property. The groups began to engage in physical fights. They refused to eat together. They refused to participate in activities that would bring them into contact with each other. The researchers observed that the boys who had been friendly and well-adjusted just days earlier were now displaying intense hostility toward the members of the other group. The competition for scarce resources had produced exactly the kind of intergroup conflict that Sharif had predicted. In the third phase, the researchers attempted to reduce the hostility between the groups. They first tried simply bringing the groups together for non-competitive activities, such as watching movies or eating meals together. These efforts failed. The boys used these opportunities to continue their conflict, throwing food at each other, shouting insults, and refusing to interact peacefully. The researchers then introduced a series of situations that required cooperation between the groups to achieve a common goal. In one situation, the camp's water supply was cut off, and the boys had to work together to find and repair the problem. In another situation, a truck carrying supplies got stuck, and the boys had to pull it out together. In another, the boys were given money to rent a movie, but the money was insufficient unless both groups pooled their resources. In each of these situations, the boys were forced to work together. They had to coordinate their efforts, communicate, and rely on one another. Gradually, the hostility began to fade. The boys started to interact more positively. Friendships began to form across group lines. By the end of the experiment, the Rattlers and the Eagles were eating together, playing together, and expressing genuine liking for one another. The hostility that had been created through competition had been reduced through the introduction of what Sharif called superordinate goals. Goals that could only be achieved through cooperation. The Robbers' Cave experiment was hailed as a landmark study in social psychology. It provided powerful evidence that intergroup conflict could be created and reduced through environmental factors, without any change in the personalities of the individuals involved. The boys who had become hostile toward each other were the same boys who had been friends with their own group members, the same boys who were well-adjusted and psychologically healthy. Their behavior was shaped by the situation, not by any inherent prejudice or aggression. The study had profound implications for understanding real-world conflicts, from racial segregation to international war. It suggested that if competition could be replaced with cooperation toward shared goals, even deeply entrenched conflicts could be resolved. The study became a foundational text in the field of conflict resolution and was widely cited in efforts to reduce prejudice and promote integration. But the Robbers' Cave experiment also raised significant ethical questions. The boys in the study were children 11 years old, and they were not told that they were participating in an experiment. They believed they were at a summer camp. They were not informed about the purpose of the research, and they were not given the opportunity to consent to their participation. Their parents had given permission, but they had been told that the camp was a typical summer camp experience. They were not told that their children would be deliberately placed in situations designed to create conflict and hostility. The researchers manipulated the boys' environment to induce anger, frustration, and aggression. They allowed the boys to engage in physical fights, property destruction, and emotional distress. They did not intervene when the conflict escalated to levels that caused genuine psychological harm. The boys experienced real anger, real fear, and real distress during the experiment. They were then manipulated again to reduce the conflict, but the experience of hostility was not erased. Critics of the experiment argued that the manipulation of children's emotions without their knowledge or consent was ethically problematic. They noted that the boys were subjected to psychological stress that could have lasting effects. They also noted that the boys were not debriefed after the experiment in the way that modern ethical standards would require. They were not told that the conflicts had been deliberately engineered or that they had been part of a study. They left the camp believing that the events of the summer had been natural occurrences, not the product of a research design. The study also raised questions about the generalizability of its findings. The boys were all from similar backgrounds, all white, all middle class, all 11 years old. Whether the same dynamics would operate in other populations was unclear. Despite these ethical concerns, the Robbers Cave experiment remains a landmark in the study of intergroup relations. It demonstrated the power of competition to create conflict and the power of cooperation to resolve it. It showed that ordinary children, placed in a competitive environment, could quickly develop intense hostility toward an outgroup, and that this hostility could be overcome by creating situations that required joint effort toward shared goals. The study has been replicated in various forms and has influenced generations of research on prejudice, discrimination, and conflict resolution. It has been cited in efforts to integrate schools, to promote cooperative learning, and to design interventions for reducing intergroup conflict in communities around the world. The Robbers Cave experiment also stands as an important example of the ethical tensions that can arise in social science research. Sharif and his colleagues believed that the knowledge gained from the study justified the methods they used. They argued that the boys were not permanently harmed, that the experiences were within the range of normal childhood conflicts, and that the insights gained about reducing prejudice and conflict had immense social value. Critics argued that the manipulation of children without their knowledge or consent was inherently wrong, regardless of the value of the knowledge obtained. The study contributed to the growing movement for ethical oversight in research with human subjects, and it is frequently discussed in courses on research ethics as an example of the need to balance scientific inquiry with the protection of participants' welfare. The Robbers Cave experiment endures as a powerful demonstration of the social dynamics that can turn ordinary people against one another. It shows that conflict does not require monsters or villains. It can emerge from the simple fact of competition over limited resources. It also shows that conflict can be overcome, not by appeals to reason or by bringing people together in superficial ways, but by creating circumstances in which they must work together to achieve goals that matter to them. The boys who spent that summer at Robbers Cave left with experiences that shaped their understanding of friendship, conflict, and cooperation. They also left as participants in an experiment that, for all its scientific value, used them as subjects without their knowledge. The study remains a testament to the power of social situations to shape human behavior and a reminder of the ethical responsibilities that accompany that power. The U.S. Army biological weapon tests. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the United States Army conducted a series of secret biological weapons tests in cities across America. These tests were part of a larger program designed to assess the vulnerability of the American homeland to biological attack and to develop defensive capabilities against such weapons. The tests involved the release of live bacteria and chemical simulants over populated areas, often without the knowledge or consent of the people who were exposed. The Army believed that the agents being used were harmless or posed minimal risk to human health. But this belief was based on incomplete science, and in some cases it was tragically wrong. The tests exposed millions of American civilians to potentially hazardous substances, and they were kept secret for decades. When the truth finally emerged, it revealed a pattern of government experimentation on the American public that was shocking in its scale and its disregard for the rights and well-being of the citizens who were meant to be protected. The biological weapons testing program was conducted under the auspices of the Army Chemical Corps, which operated out of facilities at Fort Detrick in Maryland, Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, and other military installations across the country. The program had multiple components. Some tests involved the release of biological simulants, harmless bacteria or chemical tracers that were intended to mimic the behavior of more dangerous agents. Other tests involved the release of live bacteria that were believed to be non-pathogenic but that could, under certain conditions, cause illness. The tests were conducted in a wide range of environments: in subways, in office buildings, in residential neighborhoods, and over entire cities. The Army's goal was to understand how biological agents would disperse in real-world conditions, how far they would travel, how long they would remain viable, and what concentration would be required to effectively target a population. The data collected from these tests was used to develop defensive measures, including vaccines, detection systems, and decontamination procedures. One of the most extensive series of tests was conducted in New York City between 1966 and 1967. The Army, working with the New York City Transit Authority, released Bacillus globigii, a bacterium believed to be harmless, into the city's subway system. The release was accomplished using glass bulbs filled with the bacteria, which were dropped onto subway tracks as trains passed. The wind created by the moving trains dispersed the bacteria throughout the subway tunnels and into the stations above. The Army had placed sampling devices throughout the subway system to measure the spread of the bacteria. The tests revealed that the bacteria traveled rapidly through the system, reaching stations far from the release points within minutes. The Army also conducted tests in which the bacteria were released from moving vehicles on city streets, from rooftops, and from other locations. The tests demonstrated that biological agents could be effectively dispersed in an urban environment and that large populations could be exposed without their knowledge. San Francisco had already been the site of a major biological weapons test in 1950, when the Navy released serratia marcescens over the city in what was called Operation Sea Spray. But the Army's testing program extended to many other cities as well. In St. Louis, Minneapolis, and other locations, the Army released zinc-cadmium sulfide, a fluorescent chemical tracer, over vast areas. The releases were conducted from airplanes and ground-based generators, and the chemicals settled over homes, schools, businesses, and farms. The Army placed sampling devices throughout the affected areas to track the spread of the chemical. The zinc-cadmium sulfide was believed to be harmless, but it contained cadmium, a heavy metal that is toxic in sufficient quantities. The long-term health effects of exposure to the chemical were never adequately studied. The Army also conducted tests in Washington, D.C., releasing simulants from the roof of the Pentagon and from other government buildings to assess the vulnerability of the nation's capital to biological attack. The tests were not limited to simulants. In some cases, the Army released live pathogens that were known to cause disease in humans. At the Army's Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, open-air tests were conducted using bacteria that cause tularemia, also known as rabbit fever, a highly infectious and potentially fatal disease. The tests were conducted in desert areas, but there were concerns that the bacteria could drift beyond the test site and affect nearby communities. In one incident in 1968, a test involving the nerve agent VX went awry, killing thousands of sheep in the nearby Skull Valley. The incident drew public attention to the testing program, but the full extent of the biological weapons tests remained secret. The Army's testing program was not limited to outdoor environments. The Army also conducted tests inside buildings, using simulants to study how biological agents would spread through ventilation systems and how they could be detected and neutralized. In one series of tests, the Army released simulants in the New York City Post Office building, in the Pentagon, and in other government and commercial buildings. The tests were conducted without the knowledge of the people who worked in those buildings. The Army wanted to understand how quickly a biological agent could spread through a large office building and how many people could be exposed before the agent was detected. The tests revealed that biological agents could spread rapidly through building ventilation systems and that large numbers of people could be exposed before any protective measures could be implemented. The existence of the Army's biological weapons tests was unknown to the American public for more than 2 decades. The tests were classified as secret, and the Army took measures to ensure that they were not discovered. Records were stored in secure facilities, and personnel involved in the tests were instructed not to discuss them. It was not until the mid-1970s that the tests began to come to light. In 1976, the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy, held hearings on the military's domestic testing programs. During these hearings, the Army acknowledged that it had conducted more than 200 biological weapons tests in populated areas between 1949 and 1969. The Army also acknowledged that the tests had been conducted without the knowledge or consent of the people who were exposed. The hearings revealed that the tests had exposed millions of Americans to biological simulants and chemical tracers, and that in some cases, the agents used had been of unknown or questionable safety. The revelations sparked outrage. The people of San Francisco learned that they had been sprayed with Serratia marcescens without their knowledge. The people of New York learned that bacteria had been released in their subway system. The people of St. Louis and Minneapolis learned that they had been dusted with zinc-cadmium sulfide. Many people who had lived in these cities at the time of the tests expressed anger and fear. They wanted to know whether their health had been affected, whether their children had been harmed, and why the government had used them as test subjects without their consent. The Army's defense was that the agents used were believed to be harmless at the time and that the tests were necessary for national security. But critics pointed out that the Army had not obtained informed consent, had not monitored the health effects of the tests, and had not taken responsibility for any harm that might have resulted. The revelations also led to legal action. In the 1980s, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of residents of St. Louis who had been exposed to zinc-cadmium sulfide during the Army's tests. The lawsuit alleged that the Army had acted negligently and that the exposure had caused health problems, including cancer and other diseases. The case was dismissed on grounds that the government was immune from liability for actions taken in the interest of national security. Similar lawsuits in other cities were also dismissed. No compensation was paid to the people who had been exposed, and no individual accountability was assigned to the military officials who had authorized the tests. The Army's biological weapons testing program was terminated in the early 1970s, as the United States renounced offensive biological weapons and began to focus on defensive measures only. The International Biological Weapons Convention, which entered into force in 1975, prohibited the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons. The United States destroyed its stockpiles of biological agents and converted its biological weapons facilities to defensive research. But the domestic testing program had already been conducted, and its legacy remained. The U.S. Army biological weapon tests stand as a stark example of the dangers of secret government experimentation on civilian populations. The tests were conducted in the name of national security, but they were carried out without oversight, without accountability, and without regard for the rights of the citizens who were exposed. The military viewed the American public as a test bed, a population to be studied in order to prepare for potential attacks from foreign adversaries. The people who were exposed had no choice in the matter. They were not told what was happening to them. They were not given the opportunity to protect themselves. They were not informed of the risks, and they were not provided with medical follow-up when the tests were over. They were treated as means to an end, and the end was defined by the military's perception of national security needs. The tests also revealed the limitations of the concept of harmless biological agents. The military's assumption that Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigii were safe was based on incomplete knowledge. Both bacteria have since been shown to be opportunistic pathogens that can cause serious infections in vulnerable individuals. The people who developed infections following the San Francisco test may have been the direct victims of that incomplete knowledge. The people who were exposed to zinc-cadmium sulfide were exposed to a heavy metal whose long-term health effects were not fully understood. The military's confidence in the safety of these agents was not matched by a commitment to monitoring the health outcomes of the people who were exposed. The U.S. Army biological weapon tests are a reminder that the protection of human subjects in research requires not only ethical guidelines but also robust oversight and transparency. When research is conducted in secret, when the public is not informed, and when the subjects are not given a voice, the potential for abuse is enormous. The tests also demonstrate that the line between national security and human rights can become dangerously blurred when the government sees its own citizens as potential test subjects. The people who were exposed to the Army's tests were not enemy combatants or foreign agents. They were Americans going about their daily lives, and they were treated as part of an experiment they never agreed to join. The legacy of these tests is a legacy of distrust of government, distrust of the military, and distrust of institutions that claim to act in the public interest while operating in secret. They stand as a cautionary tale about the need for transparency, accountability, and respect for the fundamental rights of all human beings, even when the goal is protecting the nation from threats that may never come. The Cambridge Spitnik radiation experiment. In the early 1960s, at the height of the Cold War and the space race, researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard University conducted a series of radiation experiments that would become one of the lesser-known but deeply troubling chapters in the history of human experimentation. The experiments, which came to be known informally as the Cambridge Spitnik experiments, were designed to study the effects of radiation on the human vestibular system, the complex network of structures in the inner ear that controls balance and spatial orientation. The researchers were interested in understanding why pilots and astronauts sometimes experience disorientation, nausea, and vertigo during high-altitude flight and space travel. To study this, they exposed human subjects to radiation directed specifically at the inner ear. The experiments were conducted on vulnerable populations, including institutionalized patients and prisoners, and they were carried out without the informed consent that modern ethical standards require. The radiation exposures were significant, and the long-term health effects on the subjects remain a matter of concern to this day. The experiments were led by Dr. Charles Berry and his colleagues at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The researchers were funded by the United States Air Force and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, both of which had a keen interest in understanding the physiological challenges faced by pilots and astronauts. The vestibular system, which is responsible for detecting motion and maintaining balance, is particularly sensitive to the conditions of high-altitude flight. Pilots and astronauts often reported episodes of spatial disorientation, motion sickness, and vertigo, which could be debilitating and potentially dangerous during critical phases of flight. The researchers believed that if they could understand how the vestibular system responded to various stimuli, including radiation, they could develop better methods for screening and training pilots and for protecting astronauts during space missions. The experiments involved exposing human subjects to radiation from a small source of cesium-137, a radioactive isotope that emits gamma rays. The radiation was directed specifically at the inner ear using a collimator, a device that focuses radiation into a narrow beam to target the vestibular apparatus. The subjects were placed in a specially designed chair that allowed the researchers to control the position of the head and to direct the radiation precisely. The subjects were then exposed to radiation for varying periods of time, with the goal of studying how the radiation affected their balance, their perception of motion, and their susceptibility to nausea and vertigo. The researchers measured the subjects' responses using a variety of techniques, including tests of balance, eye movements, and subjective reports of dizziness and nausea. The subjects of these experiments were not volunteers who had been fully informed about the risks of the procedures. They were drawn from vulnerable populations that were easily accessible to the researchers. Some of the subjects were patients at the Fernald State School, the same institution in Massachusetts where children had been fed radioactive cereal in the radiation experiments of the 1940s and 1950s. Others were patients at the Walter E. Fernald State School and the Wrentham State School, institutions for the mentally disabled. Still others were prisoners at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution at Norfolk. These populations were selected because they were captive. They could be monitored closely, they were unlikely to refuse participation, and they had no advocates to protect their interests. The researchers did not provide the subjects with information about the risks of radiation exposure. They did not obtain informed consent. The subjects were told that they were participating in medical research that would help advance science and medicine, but they were not told that they were being exposed to radiation that could have long-term effects on their health. The amount of radiation administered to the subjects varied. In some cases, the doses were relatively low. In other cases, they were significantly higher. The researchers were interested in determining the threshold at which radiation exposure would produce measurable effects on the vestibular system. They exposed some subjects to radiation levels that were known to cause damage to the inner ear structures. The subjects experienced dizziness, vertigo, and nausea during and after the exposures. Some vomited. Some experienced lasting balance problems. The researchers documented these effects in their records, but they did not provide any follow-up care to the subjects. When the experiments were completed, the subjects were returned to their institutions, and no further attention was paid to their health outcomes. The experiments were conducted in the context of a broader program of radiation research that was taking place across the United States during the Cold War. The federal government, through the Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of Defense, and other agencies, was funding hundreds of experiments involving the exposure of human subjects to radiation. Many of these experiments were conducted on vulnerable populations: prisoners, institutionalized children, the mentally disabled, and the poor. The researchers believed that the knowledge gained from these experiments was essential for national security. They needed to understand the effects of radiation on the human body in order to protect military personnel, to develop safety standards for the nuclear industry, and to prepare for the possibility of nuclear war. But in their pursuit of this knowledge, they routinely ignored the ethical principles that should govern research with human subjects. They did not obtain informed consent. They did not minimize risks. They did not provide follow-up care. They treated human beings as expendable research material. The Cambridge Spitnik experiments, like many other radiation experiments of the era, remained secret for decades. The researchers published some of their findings in scientific journals, but they did not disclose the populations from which their subjects were drawn, and they did not reveal that the subjects had not given informed consent. The experiments were hidden from public view, and the subjects themselves were often unaware that they had been part of a research study. Some of the subjects, particularly those with mental disabilities, may never have understood what was being done to them. They were told that they were receiving medical treatment or that they were participating in a scientific study, but they were not given the information that would have allowed them to make a meaningful decision about whether to participate. The existence of the Cambridge Spitnik experiments came to light in the 1990s, during the investigation of the human radiation experiments conducted by the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. The committee was established by President Bill Clinton in 1994 to investigate the scope of the radiation experiments that had been conducted on human subjects by the federal government between 1944 and 1974. The committee reviewed thousands of documents, interviewed survivors, and held public hearings across the country. In its final report, issued in 1995, the committee documented dozens of experiments involving the exposure of human subjects to radiation. The report included detailed accounts of the experiments at the Fernald School, the experiments on pregnant women at Vanderbilt University, and the experiments on prisoners in Oregon and Washington. It also included accounts of the vestibular radiation experiments at MIT and Harvard. The committee's investigation revealed that the Cambridge Spitnik experiments had exposed vulnerable populations to significant doses of radiation without their informed consent. The committee found that the researchers had not adequately considered the risks to the subjects, and that they had not provided the subjects with the information that would have allowed them to make an informed choice about their participation. The committee also found that the researchers had not obtained approval from any institutional review board or ethics committee, because such bodies did not exist at the time. The committee recommended that the federal government provide compensation to the subjects of the radiation experiments and that it issue a formal apology for the abuses that had occurred. The federal government responded to the committee's recommendations by establishing the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments and by creating a compensation program for the victims of the experiments. In 1995, President Clinton issued a formal apology to the survivors of the radiation experiments, acknowledging that the government had failed to live up to its ethical obligations. He said, "We are here today to apologize for the past. We have learned that the government used our citizens as subjects in experiments that were unethical and that were conducted without their knowledge or consent. We owe them an apology, and we owe them a commitment that this will never happen again." The apology was a significant moment, but for many of the survivors it came too late. Many had already died. Others had suffered for decades without knowing that their health problems might be connected to the experiments they had endured. The Cambridge Spitnik experiments stand as a reminder of the ethical failures that can occur when researchers are allowed to operate without oversight and when vulnerable populations are treated as expendable. The experiments were conducted at two of the most prestigious universities in the world by researchers who were respected in their fields. They were funded by the federal government, which had a responsibility to ensure that the research it supported was conducted ethically. Yet the experiments proceeded without informed consent, without consideration of the long-term risks, and without any mechanism for accountability. The subjects of the experiments were among the most vulnerable members of society: institutionalized patients, prisoners, and people with mental disabilities. They were chosen precisely because they were vulnerable, because they would not refuse, and because their voices would not be heard. The legacy of the Cambridge Spitnik experiments is complex. On one hand, the experiments contributed to scientific knowledge about the vestibular system and about the effects of radiation on human physiology. This knowledge may have had some value in the development of safety protocols for pilots and astronauts. On the other hand, the knowledge was obtained at a terrible cost, paid by people who never consented to be part of the research and who were never given the opportunity to protect themselves from harm. The experiments also contributed to the erosion of public trust in science and medicine, a loss of trust that has had lasting consequences for the relationship between the government and the people it is supposed to serve. The Cambridge Spitnik experiments are now largely forgotten, overshadowed by more famous cases like the Tuskegee Syphilis Study and the radiation experiments at Fernald. But they are no less significant. They represent the same pattern of abuse. The use of vulnerable populations as research subjects without their consent, the prioritization of scientific knowledge over human welfare, and the absence of oversight and accountability. They are a reminder that the ethical principles that now govern human subjects research, informed consent, minimization of risk, and independent review, were established precisely because of experiments like these. The principles of the Belmont Report, the regulations of the Institutional Review Board, and the ethical codes that guide researchers today are all responses to the abuses that occurred in experiments like the Cambridge Spitnik experiments. They are the legacy of the people who were used as subjects without their consent, and they are the best guarantee that such experiments will never happen again. The 15th experiment on this list marks the end of our examination of experiments that should never have happened. From the betrayal of the Tuskegee men to the radiation exposures in Cambridge, these experiments share a common thread. They treated human beings as means to an end rather than as ends in themselves. They were conducted by researchers who believed that the pursuit of knowledge justified the suffering of their subjects, and they were allowed to proceed because there were no mechanisms in place to stop them. The legacy of these experiments is not only the suffering they caused, but also the ethical framework that arose in response to them. The Nuremberg Code, the Belmont Report, the Institutional Review Board, and the requirement for informed consent are all the children of these experiments. They are the safeguards that now protect human subjects from the abuses of the past. They are the reason that experiments like these should never happen again. Ending. We have now reached the end of this journey through 15 experiments that should never have happened. From the betrayal at Tuskegee to the radiation rooms of Cambridge, these stories share a common thread. They remind us that the pursuit of knowledge, no matter how noble its intention, can never justify the sacrifice of human dignity. The legacy of these experiments is not only the suffering they caused, but also the ethical safeguards that rose from their ashes, the Nuremberg Code, the Belmont Report, and the Institutional Review Boards that now stand guard over every study involving human subjects. We owe it to those who endured these injustices to remember their stories and to ensure that such abuses are never repeated. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future deep dives into history, science, and the human condition. Leave a comment below. Tell us which of these experiments shocked you the most, or share your thoughts on how far we have come in protecting human subjects. And if you know someone who should understand these stories, share this video with them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.